In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made.
In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it.
There was a man sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning the light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light.
The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him.
Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God.
The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth.
The Greek word that we translate as word in John 1 is logos. Logos means word and also means reason, as in reasonable. Considering the word part of logos, it means more than just a word, perhaps more along the lines of what we mean when we say, I just received word from the hospital.
I went through John and I read some different things, and again Jesus seems to be saying, to be painting a picture of himself as the source of life. He's the giver of life-giving water, the light of the world, a Sabbath breaker and peacemaker. He's the gate for the sheep, the bread of life. He's the master who became our friend, the true vine, the good shepherd. In other words, Jesus is the source of all life, of all things good.
If you look at the Bible, there are these things that Jesus does, like he goes out to parties or he goes alone on the mountain, and then there are these radical things he does, like turns water into wine or invites himself to a tax collector's house. And I can't do those things. And I know that I'm actually not supposed to do those things.
I had this really clear idea when I finished high school of what it meant to follow Jesus. And I had a hierarchy of vocations in mind, with overseas missionary somewhere at the top and running your own business somewhere down the bottom. Marriage and having kids were desirable and expected, but probably a distraction. What I really needed to focus my attention on was the less fortunate and the needy, and the other things could wait. They needed to come second.
For the Jews, words were active and did things. When Isaac blessed Jacob instead of Esau, the blessing was out there, already at work, and couldn't just be taken back. Considering that words were powerful when spoken by men, how much more so for God? And that's what we see in the creation story. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Barclay paraphrases John like this: if you wish to see that word of God, if you wish to see the creative power of God, if you wish to see that word which brought life to every man, look at Jesus Christ. In him, the word came among you. You've probably heard the saying, you can't step into the same river twice. Well, that actually comes from a Greek philosopher named Heraclitus, who lived around 560 BC. For Heraclitus, that proverb expressed how dynamic and changing everything was. So if everything's so dynamic and changing, what stops it from all turning into chaos? The logos of God. For the Greeks, logos was the principle governing the cosmos. Philo of Alexandria, who was alive at the time of Jesus, gave the illustration of God, who, as the pilot of the universe, holds the Logos as a tiller, and with it steers all things. John said, the Word became flesh. Barclay suggests that we could put it, the mind of God became a person. So in the Logos of God, we have these attributes of God: action, order, potency, elegance, and reason. These attributes of God existed as long as God existed, but begotten of God, not made. In this sense, the Logos is the firstborn of God. In the same way that we think of breath being the first fruit of life, thought is the first fruit of existence. God exists, and reason and thought, the Logos, is the first fruit of God. John 1 tells us that the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, that Jesus is this Logos. Jesus was with God from the beginning, and as much a part of God as God's own attributes.
Then there was this formula from the outside world for a successful and fulfilling life that involved things like going to university, buying a house, getting married, having children, retiring, like in that order. And so I came into adulthood with these conflicting expectations to do something I loved as long as it was helping others. It had to be something that I could give up when I had children. I shouldn't choose anything that needed too much training or ladders to climb to get where I wanted to be because I had a time limit, and it had to be realistic. So nothing uncertain like filmmaking or writing a book or making music. With one fell swoop, I naively crossed off my list things like foreign correspondence, diplomacy, and academia. So I scrapped the formula altogether and went to Poland. Living and caring for missionary kids in an old castle in Poland gave me access to all the things I was passionate about without having to sign anything to say, this is where I'm going. I was learning a foreign language and history. I was exposed to some of the poorest people in Europe. I had exciting stories to tell. It was perfect. I started to dream of a whole life lived like this. I could even imagine marrying in that castle and having little Polish-speaking children. At the end of the year, my concerned parents convinced me to come home and study. In typical baby boomer fashion, they were concerned that I didn't have anything to fall back on. Living in a castle was all very nice for a gap year, but not a realistic option for the long term. Deciding to listen to them, I came home and found the quickest, most adventurous option I could find. I found it in Burke, in a small Christian community called Cornerstone, growing cotton and studying the Bible. It didn't really fit into the backup plan they had in mind, but considering that I'd just threatened to marry at 18 and spend the rest of my life in Poland, they were convinced and drove me out there. And I figured by the end of the year I could go back to my Polish plans.
In John's Gospel, again and again, we see Jesus describing his closeness with the Father, to the Pharisees, to the crowds, and to the disciples. After healing the lame man by the pool of Bethesda on a Sabbath, the Pharisees are harassing Jesus for breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus says, I assure you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He does only what he sees the Father doing. Whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and tells him everything he is doing. In the temple on another occasion, again talking with the Pharisees, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. If you follow me, you won't be stumbling through darkness, because you will have the light that leads to life. The Pharisees object, saying that Jesus is making false claims about himself. And Jesus' response is to say that the Father testifies about the Son, and, quoting, since you don't know who I am, you don't know who my Father is. If you knew me, then you would know my Father too. And later, after the very entertaining episode of healing the man born blind, the Pharisees are still picking bones with Jesus. Jesus says that he is the good shepherd, saying, I know my own sheep, and they know me, just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. And later, shouting out to the crowds in the temple, if you trust me, you're really trusting God who sent me. For when you see me, you are seeing the one who sent me.
For the Pharisees, I see that Jesus is a stumbling block. He's a sharp rock that people cut their hands on, trying to understand. They don't know what to do with him, and the last thing they want to do is accept him as Lord. It's really struck me reading John that Jesus didn't make things easy for the Pharisees. He didn't make things easy for Israel. He didn't sit down and explain categorically that he was the new king of the Jews. But I don't think he was being deliberately obtuse to mislead people, although he was certainly provocative. And in some senses, he was an enigma. But I think he was doing it in order to shock people into rethinking their picture of God and to awaken them. Again and again, Jesus pokes at the Pharisees, and I get the feeling that he's teasing them, and it's like he's shaking the shoulder of a person who's asleep and trying to get them to wake up.
Taking some time out, though, actually set a new path. And all that time growing cotton in the middle of nowhere, living and learning with some of the most thoughtful and switched on people I'd ever met, tuned into parts of me that love stories and analysis and hard work. I stayed on for the second year, and then the third, and each year, and the following ones after that, brought new opportunities and decisions, none of which really brought me any closer to having the piece of paper that certified me for a real job, or back to my fairy tale in Poland. When I was 25, I finally started university, an arts degree in history. I told my parents I would teach. I told lots of people I would teach. I even told myself I would teach, even though I hated the thought of it. Starting a useless degree at 25 made me uncomfortable, to say the least, but my love of foreign tales kept me going. At the end of the year, Tim and I got married, and we decided in this modern age I could probably put off things like parenting and homemaking until I was 30. At the end of our first year of marriage, I won a scholarship to go study Russian in St. Petersburg. We studied in the old university there, and then we lived with a household of missionary girls in Moscow for a month, visiting orphanages. It affected us deeply. How could we live anywhere else after seeing this? We dreamed of buying a flat or cottage near an orphanage and spending all our spare time becoming fill-in parents. 2 months after we returned home, I had a surprise pregnancy, and I was so embarrassed. And it wasn't that I didn't want children, it just didn't fit the plan. I was 27 and in the middle of a useless degree that wouldn't get me a job. I felt anxious that it would throw everything else off course. Parenting threw my ideals and strategy out the window. Instead of finding motherhood fulfilling and interesting, something I just thought would come naturally, I felt incredibly isolated as I left behind the world of thoughts and ideas and entered into the world of sleeplessness and noise. Tully was a pretty good baby, but the first 6 to 8 months of his life were like a cyclone that blew through our lives and rearranged everything I thought about who I was and what I wanted.
One of the themes in John's Gospel is the increasing opposition of the Jews. And for a while Jesus had been avoiding Jerusalem because of that opposition. Eventually, though, Jesus makes a public entry into Jerusalem. The crowds have been so impressed by Jesus' miracles and his teaching that when he enters, they welcome him as the king. So through John's Gospel, there's this increasing opposition from the Jews. There's this excitement from the crowds. They want to welcome Jesus as the king. And then also at this stage, the crucifixion is on Jesus' mind. With all of those things going on, he pushes them all back to celebrate the Passover with his disciples. And John describes what happens that night from the very intimate vantage point, reclining against Jesus at the dinner table. Jesus has been saying to the crowds and to the Pharisees that he came from God and that he and God are one. In this very special moment with the disciples, what does he say? He says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come to the Father except through me. If you had known who I am, then you would have known who my Father is. From now on you know him and have seen him." And Philip said, "Lord, show us the Father and we'll be satisfied." And oh my goodness, of all the forehead slapping moments in the Bible. But Jesus' response is patient. Philip, don't you even yet know who I am? Even after all the time I have been with you. Anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. So why are you asking to see him? Don't you believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words I say are not my own, but my Father who lives in me does his work through me. Just believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. He must have looked at Philip, and Philip was all like, or at least believe because of what you have seen me do. Jesus goes further though. He actually goes on to say that the disciples can be one with the Father the same way that Jesus is. I am the vine, you are the branches. I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey me, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father and remain in his love. You are my friends if you obey me. I no longer call you servants because a master doesn't confide in his servants. Now you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me.
When Tully was 9 months old, we moved to Newcastle to form a missional community focused at the uni there, and I started back at uni a subject a semester. I remember that first class in American history, and it felt like the first conversation I'd had in a year that wasn't about sleep or nappies. And I thought, oh, hello Jodie, I remember you. It was a lifeline. At the end of that year, I was asked by my professor if I'd consider doing honours under him because he said he could learn a lot from me. And I felt so torn between finally finding something I was really good at and the practicalities of home life. Tully was also reaching that age where we needed to start thinking about the next one. Did I even want to go through that again? Was I even allowed to stop at one? Did that create selfish children? Could I put the childbearing stage on hold for a while I pursued my own life and then come back to it when I was ready? Did that make me selfish? Tim and I grappled over the perfect age gap debate. We decided to push for me to finish my undergrad degree and then have another one, and honours could wait. After all, life was full of seasons, and this was the one for small children. When Evie was born, I went through the same feelings of isolation and lack of identity as the first time. But it took me much longer to feel like I could carve out a piece of my own life. University seemed like a distant memory, and I felt silly for thinking that I could go back to it in a year or two. In an act of desperation of having something to do other than nappies and cleaning, some little space apart from the rest of my world, I took a bunch of fabric down to my mum so that she could teach me how to sew. And then I started giving myself time to make during nap times. I started a blog as a way of processing and embracing this season that I was in. Even though sleeplessness and cleaning drove me crazy, zooming my camera into their cute feet or on something that I'd made and then writing about it reminded me of the beautiful things in my life. At university or work, you mostly have a clear-cut job to do, and then you get grades or money, some kind of tangible feedback that you're achieving something. But parenting isn't like that. In fact, when you do the most important things for reaching your goals, like training or providing healthy meals or ensuring they get enough sleep, there's a whole lot of negative feedback. Sewing and blogging helped me feel like I was creating something beautiful. But I continued to struggle with the original rules I'd set for myself as a teenager and the ideals that I'd picked up along the way spending time with other families in my 20s. We were part of an intentional mission community, and while I was studying with only one child, I was able to show up to lots of events that we ran and hang out in people's houses. I had something in common with the other students, and one child is so portable. Two is, this is your life now, fit everything around this. Suddenly the overlap I had with uni friends disappeared. Our timetable was different. Midday is the middle of the day for me. Midday is around 5 p.m. for most students. We'd have people over for dinner and I'd spend half the time in my room feeding an unsettled baby.
Jesus' disciples, on the other hand, the woman at the well, the man born blind, are awake to Jesus and his kingdom, or at least they are waking. It's particularly interesting if you remember that sleeping was also a metaphor for death in the ancient Jewish world. Those who reject Jesus, those who are asleep to him, are in a way dead because they are cut off from the source of life. But in contrast, Jesus' followers, including me and you, are awake, or at least starting to awaken to his resurrection life, which somehow begins now. This means that we are like children who have been woken in the early morning, while many of our brothers and sisters are still asleep.
Jesus is inviting the disciples to be connected with the Father the same way that Jesus is connected with the Father. There's these profound parallels. We've got Jesus and the Father on one side, and we've got Jesus and the disciples on the other side. For the Father loves the Son and tells him everything he is doing. In turn, Jesus says to the disciples, "I no longer call you servants, you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father has told me." As the Good Shepherd, he says, "Just as my Father knows me and I know the Father, I know my own sheep and they know me. Even as the Father has loved me, I have loved you."
And this makes me think that our task for the sleepers, for those who are still asleep, is what Jesus was for Israel. A beautiful, healing, and sometimes shocking reminder that Jesus is Lord, something that provokes people, something that causes people to have to make a choice about it.
And then there were the haunts from our time travelling. We'd seen so much poverty and pain. How could I feel dissatisfied with my life? How could I say I needed something like sewing to help me be thankful for it? How could we be committing our time to the most privileged people in the world and then our hobbies on the weekend when we'd wanted to give our lives to the least? I blogged about these things one weekend after opening a little online store to sell my handmade goods. And I received an email from a friend that we'd met at uni. She wrote to say that she was really thankful that we'd chosen this for now and that she'd been impacted by it. It really challenged me. Here I was thinking, this is not what I expected things to look like, God. I think we've got it wrong somewhere. Why didn't you make me more the kind of person that functioned quite well on 3 or 4 hours of sleep? The kind of person who derives energy from being with people rather than needing time out. And why are we here when the people over there need us far more? Why did you send me these little people when I'm actually very good at adult conversation? Why did you find us this house when a good mission strategy would dictate that something bigger and closer would fulfill your work much more effectively? I was Jonah, and my insecurities and agenda had created my very own storm.
So when I first moved here, the girls would go out to the commons or out to the pub for a drink, and I didn't really feel like going, sometimes because I didn't feel well, or possibly just because that's not really the sort of thing that I enjoy doing. I would rather stay at home or read a book. And I think we have this idea in our head, not everyone, I think I absorbed it a little bit, that like the best way to be missional is to be extroverted, like to go out to the commons. What a great way to be missional because you're meeting people. And I felt like I was not doing the right thing because I was staying at home reading and everyone else was going out and meeting people.
Jesus, speaking of the Holy Spirit, says, "He lives with you now and will later be in you." All right, so the Holy Spirit is living with them now and will later live in them. This is Jesus who is living with them, will later live in them. This is still before the crucifixion and resurrection, remember? And Jesus says, "When I am raised to life again," and here I think he means when he is raised to life in a couple of days, "you will know that I am in my Father, and you are in me, and I am in you." The Father has told the Son everything he is doing. Jesus, in turn, has told the disciples everything the Father told him. The Father and Son know each other. And we have been invited to know the Father and Son the way they know each other. The Father loves the Son, and that is how Jesus has loved us. Once Jesus was raised from the dead, the disciples would know that Jesus is in the Father, and that they are in him and he is in them. How does all of this relate to, "As the Father sent me, so I send you"? Well, we know that the world is in a broken condition and that something needs to be done. And what does God do? He gives of his very self. We see that Jesus and the Father are one, that Jesus is an intrinsic part of God, there from the beginning. God didn't drop flies from the Goodyear blimp or send a messenger, as perhaps he tried with the prophets. He comes himself. And that is how he has sent us. As a very part of himself, not as obedient servants, but in that very painful and risky way of actually giving himself.
It was kind of like Jesus is talking a lot and then he dies and comes back and he doesn't really have much left to say except, as the Father sent me, so I send you. And I kind of thought that was like Jesus saying, you've already heard everything that I have to say. You already know me, so copy me now. It's kind of like John's version of the Great Commission in Matthew, where Matthew's like being really detailed and saying, make disciples of all nations, baptize and teach them. It's like this great set of instructions. But in this one thing, he's saying, if you've seen me and know who I am, then that is enough for you to know how to do everything.
So here it is. That evening, on the first day of the week, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. As he spoke, he held out his hands for them to see, and he showed them his side. They were filled with joy when they saw their Lord. He spoke to them again and said, Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. Then he breathed on them and said to them, Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you refuse to forgive them, they are unforgiven. We've seen this somewhere before, haven't we? The whole breathing routine. Do you remember it? And the Lord God formed a man's body from the dust of the ground and breathed into it the breath of life. And the man became a living person. It's like God made us as a part of creation and then breathed into us to make us alive. And then Jesus came from God and as a part of God, as the realization of the fullness of mankind, and invited us to also be a fully part of God. And then he breathed on them to give them this new life.
Most of the time I don't feel sent when I'm at an event or hanging out with a friend, but often in retrospect, I do look back and think, wow, I think I was sent by God, and I do think I had some kind of a role there. I remember having dinner with a friend, a non-Christian group of friends, and afterwards they just said they really felt like there was something good going on in that dinner, and it made me think that's such a little thing. Like, for us, having dinner with friends is a really common thing, but they really appreciated it, and that made me think, well, God used us in the experience. And also I think of Feast Paint Wars, and I think of the field filling up with people who really want to come and have fun and join in an event that we'd planned to be fun and on campus, and it just being this really exciting thing where I didn't think anyone would turn up, and it turned out to be probably the biggest event of the year, and I think because of that we got Club of the Year. And it made me think there are lots of people on campus who want to be part of the things that we're doing, things that bring goodness and joy and creativity and bring people together.
So being sick is something that I wrestle with in my everyday life. I just wonder why I'm sick. There's lots of things that I really want to do, and like really good things. I just have this passion and this energy, and I think the things that God really wants me to do, and I wonder why God would put this desire in me if he would then not give me like the strength to be able to do it. But I think that God doesn't ask me to understand, he just asks me to trust. And I think that even though I'm sick, I can still see a lot of good that comes from being sick. And I think that there's probably good that comes from it every day. I just don't always see it. Like this year alone, I've had lots of really good conversations with people. I think that we walk through life with walls between us, and there's something about being unwell that just brings down people's walls. I've been able to meet people this year and just be really real with them and like have my walls down because I'm not well enough to keep them up, which means that I've just been able to talk to all different sorts of people who were wounded and hurt and don't understand why there's suffering in the world. And instead of having all the answers, I've just been able to share my thoughts on how I can still love God and trust Him and believe that He didn't intend the world to be like this and that He won't leave it like this.
After about 18 months of sewing and blogging and making friends online with the crafty community, I was reading a blog post by a friend in the States, a professional craft blogger who was struggling with very hard news about her health and was also grieving sending her youngest off to school. She was going to take a break to process it all. I felt so deeply for her, and the idea popped into my head to make her a quilt, one that I'd had in mind to represent my own struggles with the seasons of womanhood, my struggle with my lack of control and my slow handing it over. I stitched a picture of a tree in the shape of a pregnant woman, because a tree is something affected by the weather and the seasons, completely out of its control, and yet we see her changes as part of her beauty, not her weakness. I surrounded it with hexagons that I'd hand-stitched together while praying for friends of mine who also struggled, and pushing back all the thoughts that told me it was too silly, too personal, too intense. I finished the quilt, wrote a card and a poem, and mailed it to her. A week or so later, I received a message. She said that she was due back to start work that day after dropping her daughter off from school, but she'd had nothing to write about. But when she came home, my quilt was there waiting at the door for her. She said it was a precious gift that gave her encouragement and hope to keep going, and it gave her something to write about. I was dumbstruck. Made in the chaos of my own little life, the only thing I knew how to do, and something I wasn't even going to do. I felt like the little boy who'd given Jesus his lunch and he'd used it to feed a crowd. When I think of Jesus as the very expression of God, I think of him using a little boy's bread and fish. I think of him encouraging Mary to study under him, even though she was needed in the kitchen. Of him welcoming the woman with perfume for his feet, even though it was expensive. He seemed to encourage all manner of ways of giving to him and loving him without judging whether it was useful or if it would be socially acceptable or within the expected norms.
That is how He has sent us, as a very part of Himself, not as obedient servants, but in that very painful and risky way of actually giving Himself.
Our task for the sleepers, for those who are still asleep, is what Jesus was for Israel. A beautiful, healing, and sometimes shocking reminder that Jesus is Lord, something that provokes people, something that causes people to have to make a choice.
It's kind of like John's version of the Great Commission in Matthew, where Matthew's like being really detailed and saying, make disciples of all nations, baptize and teach them. It's like this great set of instructions. But in this one thing, he's saying, if you've seen me and know who I am, then that is enough for you to know how to do everything.
When I think of him saying, as the Father sent me, so I send you, I think of him saying, you who you are now with the things that you've chosen and the things that have been chosen for you, you with the sorrows and joys that are just a part of life, you with your carefully planned and the unexpected, you where you live and with those who live with you. I think that's how he sends us.
you.